Good morning. We are in the conclusion and review Hemshech Ayin Beis, volume 3, on top of page 1430. End of the paragraphs. So the Rebbe Rashab introduced now, and I said this is from a Biyuri Azer of the Tzemach Tzedek, based on a mimer of the Alter Rebbe, to understand, like he wrote, a Bir Inyan Hanal, to understand the Shinui, that Maisa Tachtenim, our actions, what relationship do they have to above? Because we also want to preserve the integrity of Ani Hashem Leishan, you see, that's not impacted, and yet we know that God wants a relationship with us. So how do we reconcile these two things? That there's no impact, Leishan, you see, like we learned in the higher levels of the Midos, higher than Atzilus, and even in Atzilus is Leishan, you see. And then, at the same time, Ma'aseh Tachtenim is Negeya above. So, to explain that further, that begins in Malchus of Atzilus as it manifests in Matat, into Biyah, he brought this Bir Azer to explain a Zayar. I want to go back to the very Zayar. I had asked our dear friend Yitzchok to post the whole text on the group so we could see the full context, because the Rebbe Rashab only quotes a few pieces of it, but when you see the whole thing, obviously it becomes clearer. I'm actually going to read it. Why not? Let's look at the whole text of the Zayar and then see how the Mefarshei HaZayar, the Eir HaChama, explains it, and then how Chassidus explains it, and all to help us understand this process. So it's a fascinating Zayar that actually talks about that. We didn't post the context. The context is actually talking about the daughters of Lot in Parshas what Parsha? Parsha of Vayera. It's a Parsha Vayera, and talks about also the events around Avram and Yitzchak, basically how God governs existence. So it's a Zayar that gives us somewhat of a peek under the dashboard of the process that God uses to govern existence, Hashgacha essentially. So I'm going to read the Zayar. So we read parts of it, and you'll see the full context in a moment. Let me just open it up here. Here we are. Okay. So it's on the posuk v'hu misibis mishapech b'tarbelesav lefolam. That posuk is in Iyuv, I see, Job 37:12. Okay. So how they translate here the verse says, and they are turned round about by his devices according to their work. Yeah. So what does that mean exactly? So clearly he's talking about someone managing through devices, he's turning things, mesabiv, which means the turn. And we'll soon learn that that's like the potter's wheel. So this means, I'm just going to read the English. The Hebrew, the Aramaic is there as well. So he says like this, what does this mean? That the Holy One, Hashem, this verse is talking about they're turned around by his devices, they're talking about God. That what? That he constantly turns the wheel of events, bringing hidden things to the top, and then again giving another turn and shaping things differently. So not every expression in the Zohar is going to be explained, but this is the context of it all. So essentially, and thus by his devices, he is ever scheming and planning how to affect the change and make a new pattern. So you see the word change is used here. Let me see. Yeah. So clearly, in managing existence, that's called managing. When you govern something, or you in some way, like he says here, turning the wheel of events, what is he called? Just Mesabib Suvim. Okay, then he continues. What means according to their work? This is a critical piece relevant to us. What it means according to their work. In other words, what determines how God will turn the wheel? Will it be a wheel that will produce positive results, meaning good blessings, or God forbid the opposite? So that's what the verse says, Tarbelesav, that it says, that it depends on according to their work. The variation takes place in accordance to the works and deeds of man. In other words, how we behave, in turn, will affect how God will turn the wheel of fortune, if you wish. Yeah, maybe that's not a good word to use here, but you get the idea. The verse continues, according as he commandeth them upon the face of the habitable world. That is, it's in accordance with man's works that God shapes the course of events and all that he ordains on the face of the world. So we see here that this is a two-way street. It's not just that God created existence, and just like the sun and the moon, obviously is also part of God's devices. That God causes, the sun rises, the moon, God set in motion a whole program that runs existence. That's not dependent on our actions. That's like I mentioned the 6 days of creation. God created a beautiful world with systems and species, and all of nature has a whole series of laws of nature that God implanted into existence that work. But here we're talking about, obviously, that which is impacted by our actions. Because then on the 6th day of creation, when Adam and Chava were created, now we have human beings who were empowered to make changes. And that too, and that also will affect so-called the turning wheel of God, the way God governs the face of the world, as he said. Then he continues, and I think this is more where the section that the Rebbe Rashab quotes says like this. Rabbi Lezer interpreted the words like this, and they turned around about by his devices. Here is how he interprets it: that the Holy One, Hashem, guides the course of events so as to bring to pass a seemingly stable state of things. So that's the creation, is a stable, predictable, deterministic universe. I use that word very precisely. But when the sons of men, which means when human beings, imagine that all before them is fixed and firmly established. In other words, they take life for granted, and they think that this is just something that they deserve, they're entitled to. Then Hashem turns his works into something altogether different from their former state. And that's where the commentary, the Eir HaChaim, says, what does that mean? That's what we learned. When people think that it's all being preserved, so the Eir HaChaim says that the generations, like the generation of the Mabul, they took their life for granted. They thought they'd live forever. Yeah, so they therefore did not appreciate and were not sensitive to their behavior. They did whatever they wanted. It's like someone feels there's no consequences, no accountability. I'm reading from the parentheses in the actual text of Ayin Beis now. That's the commentary on that piece of Zohar, that when they misbehaved in that way, took this whole structure God created. He created a beautiful world. You take it for granted, and not just take it for granted, you behave in ways that are not the way you were told to behave. So it's like God creating, it's like simply the idea of somebody living a life, they have a healthy life, their body is healthy, their life is blessed, and then they take it for granted and they start doing things that are inappropriate. So what happens? Suddenly your body, you start doing things that are not healthy, and you start being self-destructive. So it's not like just a guarantee. The sun and the moon, yes, will rise in their time, but a human being's actions have an effect, especially on us. So you see here that it's not just, the first part, creation, there you could say, Lo Shanisi. The sun will always rise, no matter what. Lo Yishbeisu is the expression in Parsha Noach. After the Mabul said, God, I will never disrupt the laws of nature again. But that's the laws of nature. There's Lo Shanisi. But there is Shinui through Ma'aser Tachtenim. So that's what the Zohar is addressing, as we'll soon discuss what's the intention of the Zohar with all this. But I'm still reading. I want to just finish reading the Zohar, a little more to read, and then we'll go back to the Ayin Beis. So then he continues and says like this. Okay, he says, we change that. Fashions, okay, to this, into something altogether different from their former state. And the Chama explains that's like the Mabul. Further, he said, we may translate not devices, but device. When it says, B'tach b'leisei ksiv, so let me just see, what does it say in the Pasuk? B'tach b'leisov. You could teach it b'tach say. Let me see how he teaches this. 1 second. Okay. We pronounce it b'tach of plural, but you could also read it. It's written in the singular. So he says kahai umna. So it's compared to be an instrument, comparing God to be a potter who in turning his potter's wheel constantly fashions new vessels according to his fancy. So you see here the changes. When a potter is shaping the pot with his wheel, so it can go many directions. He could shape it this way, he could shape it that way. So he's using this example to show how will he shape it based on our behavior. So it is Hashem constantly reshaping his works. The instruments which constitutes his potter's wheel, so to speak, being the lower world judgment court. So that's called like the Bezdin Shalamata, basically. I don't know how they translate it exactly, but regardless, tikla, that's the tikla, which shifts and changes. And all is done in accordance with man's works. All this is dependent on not just our God-planned existence, but now how God's responding to our efforts. If they are good, meaning human behavior is good, the wheel revolves to the right, making the course of events highly favorable to them. And however long the wheel revolves, punishment never settles on that side. So that's chesed, yamin. However, should men, turn to evil, so then Hashem says, to evil ways, then Hashem imparts to his device a spin to the left, and all things now take a direction to the left, which is gvura, din, judgment. And the wheel gives to events a course unfavorable to human beings. And then finally it concludes, ukadin tikla, so goes until they become, that this is how the wheel turns, until they become penitent, meaning they regret and they retrace their evil ways and do tshuva. But the motive power of the wheel is centered in the works of man, hence the phrase by his device according to their work. There being no permanency. Not sure what he means by that, but it probably means that it's constantly changing. Right, like he said before, you can't just expect automatically it's up to Maisa Tachtenim. This is the Zohar. Now the Tzemach Tzedek, or the Rebbe Rashab, quoting the Tzemach Tzedek and the Alter Rebbe, says, what is the Zohar coming to teach us? What is it coming to explain? So I'm summing up what we learned yesterday. So he says, "V'kavonas hamaymer." I'm reading now. I'm middle of page 1429, summing up. He says, "What's the intention of the Zohar that we just summed up?" Hu shebol farish is coming to explain how is it possible that there should be ra in the world? How is there evil when mipi elyon leisei tzareyas, from God's mouth above, from his supernal mouth, evil never comes. God is totally good, like he says. God is utterly good and does good to all. So why could there be something that's destructive, that's negative, that's evil? In the parentheses, to sum up the parentheses, the Rebbe Rashab says that what we're talking about, this meitiv, that is totally good, is talking about Eid Ein Sof before, higher than Atzilus. There, because it's Eid Ein Sof, is a seamless, infinite light with just Chesed and Tev. Even not, and that's the Rav Chesed of Arich Ampin, like he says, even though there's Gvura there, but the Gvura has not taken up any Mitzias Nikeres yet. It's still all so-called subsumed within the goodness and chesed of the Oyer HaBlikvul of Arich. And how much more so when you're talking about Atik, like he says a little further. A dogma for the Yesh Leimer, he says, this is a dogma to Eid Ein Sof before the Tzimtzum, where there was only simply Eid Ein Sof, divine energy, completely positive. And it was made begillied through the Oisius Harashim. There were Oisius, but the Oisius are not Nikr at all, because what dominates is purely the Ur, like we spoke about Isis on the higher levels. They're not yet obvious, they're not yet shaped. Hakol b'chinas ein sof mamish. The fact that there are levels, yes, in each level there's Isis, but still, what dominates there is the Ur ein sof, like he says in the parentheses. So similarly, Chesed also as Bechlal is like Ur ein sof lifnei tzimtzum. So based on that, you're talking about a level that's totally good. So there's no evil coming from that place. And especially in Atik, less smaller b'hai Atika, like we learned earlier. Furthermore, he says, even in Atzilus, in Zoh, what dominates is still Chsadim. Even though in Zoh you already have Gvura, there is already a defined emotion or attribute called Gvura, but it's still dominated by Chesed. So no matter whether you're talking about L'mayla Atzilus, if you remember we spoke Leisha Nisi, L'mayla Atzilus, and even Atzilus is Leisha Nisi, it's all primarily K'tev and Meitiv, goodness. So then the question is, and that's what the Zohar is coming to understand, so where's negative evil come from? So that's where he continues, V'rak basurusa de latata, in the language of the Zohar, or from the Pasuk, what was the Lashon there? The Folam, the language of the human behavior. From the pasuk was v'hu masibas misapat lefolam. Yeah. According to their work, so it was called masus latata. Our work below is what causes things. But like he said in the Zohar, when we don't behave accordingly and we're not aligned to the goodness of above, so we're the ones that bring upon ourselves dinim from gvuras from above, to the point that beriba yishtalshlus, like I gave the example yesterday, if we misunderstand the tzimtzum and we think the concealment means that God is removed from us, God forbid, and we're not accountable, and we can take for granted everything, and as a result our behavior deteriorates, then what happens is ultimately we're bringing din and gvuras emerging, like he said, the wheel turning to the left, and that in turn with ariba yishtalshlus can create ra gomur lamata, like we see that ultimately the injustices that human beings can perpetrate against each other is a result because they think they're alone, they think that they're independent and there's no one watching and there's no one caring and there's no one in control. A godless world. It's a result of our misunderstanding the whole concealment and furthermore abusing it. And to drive the point home, he said, this is what it says here in the Zohar, Duta susilatata, the wheel turns to the left and causes this misfortune, as he put it. This is what it says in Medrash. That when the Eibishter established things, he established here, behold, I present to you good and the negative. And good only goes to those that do good, and bad to those that do bad. Lo yotze teva le'esei, nothing good will go to those that do bad, and nothing bad will happen to those that do good. Because everything is dependent on our actions. Like he brings from Parsha, the second Medrash, that it comes, Elamei leha hara ba le'esei ra v'teva le'esei teva. So in other words, it's all coming as cause and effect that God implanted, that our behavior will have a reaction, our actions will have a reaction, and that's what he means by the potter's wheel, that the wheel will turn according to the way we behave. We cause those changes to take place. And he says, like he brings from the Gemara in Kedushin, which the Rambam brings, which is that when you do one mitzvah, you literally can tip the scales, l'kav schus. And then finally, he brings from the Emek HaMelech, I'm just reviewing again what we learned yesterday, that Mepi Elyon goes on Arech Hampin, and also on Zoh, like we learned before, because Arech Hampin is Kulei Tev, all good. So there's Mepi Elyon, that's the mouth, the supernal mouth, and there's no Shaykh anything negative. And also in Zoh and Atzilus, which is Be'ikar Chsadim, So how is it? So where does anything negative come from? It's our ma'aseh tachtenim, our actions, that reach to this level of malchus, which is the wheel. And that's what the Zohar is coming to discuss. That's its main focus. Where does it impact our behavior? How far does it reach? Ad heichen hu magia, the Allah's man. So we know higher in Atzilus and for sure in Chesed and Lifnei Tzimtzum, our actions don't have impact because there God is running the show. He's turning the wheel as He sees fit, and it's all good. It's our actions that affect Malchus. That's where the shifts happen. So the changes in the behavior and the affairs of this world shift in Malchus as a result of our actions. Shamagia raka b'chinas Malchus Atzilus, shamagia salmash shalamata v'lo yesher hagavei l'mayla, and not higher than Malchus. So obviously we still need to understand. So what happens to our ma'aseh tachtenim higher than Malchus? Is it completely ignored? It has no impact at all? But that's what the Zohar says. And obviously it's coming to explain this whole subject matter, where change takes place and so on. So we're going to learn, obviously, that of course it affects also higher, but not in a way of a shinui. It's more, as we'll see, in a more indirect fashion. But we'll get to that in the next paragraph. So I'm glad we went over the Zohar more, the whole full Zohar. It makes the context a lot easier to understand. And the explanation, as I said, from the Tzemach Tzedek, Alter Rebbe, and additional Rebbe Rashab, say Sofis, additions, but it's all based on that Tzemach Tzedek Maimer, which is based on the Alter Rebbe's Maimer. Okay. Now, as I said, we still have more to go, but if anybody has questions on what we learned now, what we reviewed now, I'm happy to take any questions, and then we'll continue. Va'inyanhu. So now, the new paragraph on page 1430. What's the inyan in this? So he's going to explain this al Chesed now. Well, until now, I was also explaining al Chesed, but he explain it more in more hasbara, more explanation to understand exactly what we're talking about here. It's known and explained earlier. And the pages, if you want to follow the text, can be found at ayinbeis.com, I should mention. What's known and explained earlier? The essence spheres of Atzilus, that the 10 spheres of Atzilus in general, they serve like an interface, back to the interface, between the infinite divine light and the worlds of Biyah. Ukamaimer, this he brought before, the Maimer he brought also. Where did he bring it? A few pages back. I'm trying to find where it was exactly. I always like to see a language that was brought a bit earlier. Okay.
1427. The top of 1427.
Okay, good.
Line 5.
Okay,
onto the fikasa.
Yeah, good. Right. So he brought on page 1427 on top. Good, thank you. Yeah. So what's the point? So it's an interface, like the Maimer from Tikkun Zer, onto you are the one, the afikas. Afikas is like it's afikas from you emerged, or from you came, from you was transmitted. So there he says, there he said the language tikkunin. Esed tikkunin, that basically the 10 spheres, to do what? Lanhoge bohein almin, to govern, or to rule, or to manage the worlds. So that's the role of the Esed Sefiros. As soon as you say Lanhoga Bein Alman, that's what it is. That's an interface that God put into place, these instruments, if you wish, or devices, or whatever you want to call them, but Esed Sefiros, Tikkunin, with which to govern existence. Because the Eibishter himself, Eid Ein Sof, is Ein Sof. Like we learned, seamless, shapeless existence is a structure. So how does a shapeless, completely removed entity govern a world that is made up of structure? So the 10 spheres serve as that interface. On one hand, they're divine attributes. Chachma, Bina, Das, and so on. On the other hand, they're divine as they manifest through structure. So essentially, it's divine instruments, if you wish, which are the Sefiros, Lanhoga Behin Alman. Uba Sefiros Gufa, and the 10 spheres themselves, Ha'ikar Ubchinas Midas Dezod Atzilus. So the central body of the spheres, of course, all the 10 spheres, from Chabad all the way to Malchus, is all the spheres. But what's the center? You could say the central piece is Zoh of Atzilus, the emotions of Atzilus. The Zeu Shenikra Mides. And that's why they're called Mides. So Midas can be defined as emotions, but he's teaching Loshen Medida. Midas also from the word measurements. Medida means measured, parameters. Shenimdadu v'nigbalu, because they've been measured and they've been defined or confined or limited. Lifi efana ilamis, lias bechinas moker. They're defined according to the parameters of the worlds of existence, so they can serve as being a moker. So essentially, think of it this way: if Ein Sof on its own is completely shapeless, infinite, seamless, and no boundaries at all, how do you get that into an existence that is made up of a structure? So the Midas are that role. They take that infinite light, they channel it into a structure, Midas Mlosha Medida, accordingly that now it can be tailored to each creature according to its needs. Now remember, we learned also that the angels play a role in the processing of that, like in the digestive system. He didn't mention that yet because it's not relevant right now. We're still talking in Atzilus. We're not talking about how Atzilus gets into Biyah. So Atzilus, the essence of Atzilus, serve this interface role. Ki Ein Sof Baruch Hu, because Ein Sof on its own, Ram umisnasa aden keitz v'tachlis. It's exalted and removed completely beyond, without any limit and any end. Me'erech b'chinas esesfiras d'Atzilus. Nothing commensurate at all. Ein keitz v'tachlis compared to the esesfiras of Atzilus. Sharilad mekol in Midas klal, because the Eibush says b'chlal not defined by Midas. Midas, both attributes, emotions, definitions. That's a good word also. Medida from the word definitions. And limitations. So if you're talking about Ein Sof itself, you're talking about a level that is beyond all these structures altogether. The Kolshke Mibiyah, even from the Sefiros of Atzilus, is removed. And how much more so, the Kolshke, for sure, from Biyah, where these Sefiros become far more created entities that are not pure Iyu v'chayu ichad, Iyu v'garmu ichad, completely divine. So then the question is, again, God's Kol Yochli can do whatever he wants. But how can we make sense of Ein Sof governing a world when there's nothing in common between the two? So that's why he says, in order for there to be the governance, the management, if you wish, of the worlds of existence, this needs to be through the Midas. And I always qualify, Tzarech Liyas means after God shows that he wants a structure and wants it to make sense. Obviously, God is not bound by this. He doesn't need to do it. So Tzarech Liyas means in the world of Seichel, the way God created it, and the world where he wants us to understand the process and also retrace the steps, as I mentioned so many times, then you need Midas. You need something that defines and channels this infinite divine energy into structure. The B'chinas Chesed hu hashpah lahachis. Chesed's role, like we learned earlier, is gilui, to be mashpia lahachis, to transmit a flow that sustains. U'kameshikosa mechalkel chayim bechesed, that he mechalkel chayim, that he feeds, sustains life bechesed with kindness. V'nikra be'idra rabba daf kuf lamed gimel beis, and this level of chesed is called Chesed Olam. So in Idra Rabbah, in Zohar Pasha Nosei, he calls it Chesed Olam. Okay. Why is it called Olam? Chesed Olam. You could say chesed forever, but chesed means it's connected to elam. V'hainu, shehu b'chinas chesed, hamoker li'as nimshach mena b'chinas elam chaya gufa. It's called chaya elam because it's the source which allows it from there to be transmit the physical life in this world. Chaya gufa. Mashenke in chesed the atik. When you talk about a higher level of chesed, we talk about chesed, rav chesed of arich, and there's chesed of atik, shenikra chaya nishmosa. That's called chaya, the soul's life of the soul. Not physical life, but spiritual life. She'ena mokar klal. That's still removed and is not at all a source. Sheyimshach memenu chaya gufa b'chinas biyah kim chaya nishmosa. From there, you have only the hamshach shach of chaya nishmosa, like life, spiritual life, or the soul's life, but it's not a mocker from which to come chaya gufi. You want to have also physical life. You want to be able to have a life that sustains a physical existence. And that's chaya elam in the words of the Zohar, of the Idra Rabbah. So we see here Midos, not Midos of Keser or Atik, namely, but Midos of Atzilus serve as this interface because they're drawing it down in a way that relates to chaya gufa, the physical life in the lower worlds of Biyah. Now, Gufa doesn't necessarily mean physical, I should say. Gufa is relative to Nishmasa, is already Biyah, is already Bria, is already a creation. Nishmasa would be higher levels of spirit, of more sublime levels, you can say. Okay.
Can you take a question?
Do you mind if we finish the subject first? Let me just finish the topic.
You're the teacher.
Yeah, so give me a few more minutes here. I just want to see, 1 second, let me just see. Maybe I was going to stop here anyway. Let me just see. Okay, the next piece explains Chaya Guf and Chaya Nishmasa. Okay, the next section actually is an elaboration on what Midos mean. He's going to explain in more detailed length what Chesed is and these different levels. So we could stop here, and I'll take your question or any other questions, and then
he may answer this in what you just mentioned is coming up, but what is this inyan of Midos that is above Atzilus and Keser? I mean, I had understood that the Midos don't become, I don't know, defined, if you will. That's maybe, pardon the pun, until the world of Atzilus, when you have them and you say, go ahead.
No, you can finish. I understand your question.
But I think you get it.
Yeah.
So I don't need to finish.
The answer goes back to the analogies I've been giving of the fetus development, or when we talk about even Lifnei Tzimtzum, we talked about 10 hidden spheres. Those spheres are 10. 10 spheres include Midas. And the answer is, it's all concepts and archetypes from higher levels, and it evolves. In Atzilus, it takes on real shape and form, like he said, Hergish. But we learned earlier, like Oisius. The Oisius all originate in Etzem HaNefesh, but they don't take shape and form until later.
Mm-hmm.
So, in other words, let's say God choosing to want to manifest in definitions. We called that shemes before, names. So think of names are conceptual, emotional attributes, but there are no real emotions yet. So it's all a matter of gradation and just understanding each level accordingly.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
Why does he say, follow up, why does he say it's not I understand it's not say, she'ena makor klal sheyimshach mimenu chaya gufa. So I understand it because it's conceptual and it's spiritual. It's not mamashi. It's not tangible in any way. Even though we're talking about Atzilus, it's hard to even talk about Atzilus as something tangible. But in any case, how do you say something's it's relative. But how do you say something's mushrash and something, but that thing it's mushrash and is not a makor? I mean, that seems like
so this idea was discussed at length earlier. You remember it all? You spoke about something is a mocker, something is close to becoming a mocker, something is not a mocker at all. So this goes back to a central theme that I've repeated many times. All this is very foreign to us because we are empirical and very, we'll call it material creatures. And for us, understanding abstraction doesn't come that easily. But you have to keep in mind that when you go from the top down, the exact opposite. There are levels that are completely beyond everything. Then they start evolving and becoming something. Like can you say Atzmus is a mocker of existence? So yeah, technically, of course, he's the creator. The creator is the creator of all of existence. But we don't call that in Hebrew a mocker. A mocker would be, where did I get my water from? From a reservoir that pumped water into my water mains. That reservoir got water from the rains. The rains got the water from the evaporated oceans that went up to the clouds. All those are traceable mocker. Then there's an untraceable. When you say yesh ma'ayin, for example, where did the yesh come from? So there's a leap, a quantum leap. As soon as there's a quantum leap, the word mocker is not used quite the same way. Obviously, in English and semantics, it's the source. God is the source of everything. But there's a source that's so-called a source that's relatively, like a teacher taught a student. But where did the teacher's wisdom come from? So we say Chachma comes from Chachmas Tima. Can you call Chachmas Tima a mocker like you would call Chachma a mocker to Bina? Not quite, because Chachma and Bina are both in the world of consciousness. The world of Chachmas Tima is super consciousness. So yes, of course it's technically a source. But you would then say, ain't a mocker mamish, or something like that. You go to Atik, you'd say it's not a mocker at all. So it doesn't mean it's not this, it ultimately originates there. Originate would be the right word, but source indicates something that's closer to the thing that it's a source to.
Understood.
That's the
Thank you.
the gist of it.
Understood. Thank you.
So the higher you go, like, for example, you'll say, go back to the fetus. Someone will say, what's the source of where children are born? So you'll say, well, husband and wife sanctify themselves and they conceive a child. Okay? The husband, egg, if seed fertilizes the female ovary, the egg, but then someone will say, is that with the source of life? 1 second. What about the neshama, the soul? If you don't have the third partner, you're not going to have a life. And then the soul itself, where does the soul come from? It doesn't come from at the moment of conception. The soul's in heaven on spiritual levels. So it's the makar on neshama, but then you see makar becomes more and more distant as you go up and you abstract further and further. So it all comes down to understanding, and that's the whole point of the whole Seder Shtalshlus, frankly. The interface is like I always call the stepping stones, because each level is a makar to the next level. But then you jump a few more levels, it's not immediate makar. It's like a more distant source. There's even the expression sometimes ila va'olol siba mesubav, and then there's something that's higher than ila and siba. Okay, good.
Yes, thank you again.
Yeah. So he continues and says like this now. To explain the difference between these two levels of chesed, and just keep in mind the big picture. The big picture is we're looking for interface between a very tangible chesed in each one of us. You and I do chesed today. You give someone tzedakah, you show some kindness. That chesed can be traced to chesed of asiyah ruchnius, to chesed of yitzira, to chesed of bria, to chesed of Atzilus, to chesed of arich, to chesed of atik, all the way up. I'm not even going through all the levels. To chesed of the 10 hidden spheres, to chesed of the shemes, to chesed of shem echad, all the way up to yechelas ha'atzmus, God's ability to do chesed. So you see, that is the process. Now, obviously, each one of us has to know where we stand in this interface. Our mission, our work is to create a seamless flow of all these levels that I just described. That's why we need all these steps. These are the stepping stones, or in other language, the interface between the divine and existence. The divine itself is higher than all the Midos altogether. But then the divine wanted to manifest. Remember, he spoke about, go back, Midos Lamaila. He said, Hein Atzmim, Leishem Ispalim. It's not Midos that are impacted by us. It's that God wanted to have chesed. But now we're learning, as we're going to be learning, that Midos, we do have impact with Midos as they come through Malchus. The Rebbe Rashab is explaining all that now. So whenever we learn these things, always step back a moment and remember why did this paragraph come in the first place? It's a inyan to explain what he said before. Where our halas man, where our aveda reaches. How far does it reach in the midas lamaila? So there's midas that are midas, but they're not affected by us. Like we learned hispilus hergosha, and but not hispilus from another. Then we have midas that are not hispilus at all. The midas of, like he said, higher than Atzilus. And now he's going to get down to where midas become something that are impacted. But we haven't gotten there yet. Right now he's still talking about Atzilus. So in Atzilus, you have, in contrast to higher than Atzilus, he called it Chesed Elam, because it's already a Chesed that relates to existence, because from there comes the kindness, the flow of life, B'chalkal Chaim B'Chesed, that will give life to the physical, to let's call it, relatively speaking, the Kalim, if you wish, more than the Chaya Gufa, Chaya Nishmasa. So he's continuing to explain that. So you see the context is very vital here. Well, it's always vital, but especially here. Okay. So in Parsha Kisisa, we know there's the 13 divine attributes of compassion that were revealed to Moshe when he was praying for the Jewish people after the Chet HaEgel. But then we find another time the 13 attributes are enumerated. It's in the Sefer Micha. We actually say it, Mikael Racham V'chan, we say it by Tashlich and other places. It's in the book of Micha, in the Nevi'im. Micha was a Navi, and he talks about the Yud Gimel Midas Rachman. So Chassidus talks about the difference between the two. What's the difference between the Midas Rachman of Moshe and the ones in Micha? So he says like this: the Yud Gimel Midas Rachman, the Micha, hein ba'atik. They're in Atik, v'hein l'chaya haneshamis, shu chaya l'kus. They are chaya neshamis, called spiritual life or soul's life, which is chaya l'kus, more the manifestation of divine life. I'm skipping the parentheses for a moment, just to make the contrast. Moshe and the Yud Gimel Midas Rachim, and Moshe himshich. Yud Gimel Midas Rachman B'zah. Moshe drew down the Yud Gimel Midas Rachman, shouldn't remain so sublime. He drew them down into Zah, Zohar Ampin, the Midas of Atzilus, L'tzeda Chaya Gufim. For the purpose of Chaya Gufim, that should also, because remember, he was drawing down the Yud Gimel Midas Rachman in order to forgive the people down below for their transgression. So he brings down from Ider Rabbah, also the Ider Rabbah, 138a, that explains this difference. V'hainu mishum de Chesed Atzilus, and that's because bringing it down the Zohar Chesed of Atzilus, who shatz nisamsim l'fiyarach ha'elamis. That makes sure that the Chesed was nisamsim, was diminished to be commensurate with and proportionate to the world. So Moshe drew it down there. Back to the parentheses for a moment, not to skip it. That I just wanted to read the flow. He says, "V'nira," the Rebbe Rashab adds, it appears, means that Rebbe Rashab feels that this appears. She'ein hefresh, a hefresh b'zeh ben Atzilus l'biyah. So he's wondering basically when we say these Yud Gimel Midas Rachman of Micha that are on Atik, that are only Chaya Elikus, Chaya Neshama, how does that affect Atzilus and Biyah? So he says neither that this does not have a difference between Atzilus and Biyah. The Nimshachim Gam Ken Biyah. These Yud Gimel Midas Rachman from Atik, from Micha, also go into Biyah. Rak she'ein lebechinas Chaya Elikus. Chaya Elikus. But there they only manifest in relation to godly life, not let's call it physical life, not corporeal life. So it also affects Biyah, but remains a very high level of a divine nature. Whereas Moshe is mamshechit into Biyah, into Zah, that connects to Chaya HaGufim. Now this deserves more explanation, but briefly you could say there's a difference between Oris and Kalim, Neshama and Guf, and essentially two levels: one that remains more sublime, and one that becomes more manifest into Biyah. And the Rebbe Rashab continues in elaborating on this. And the reason he's doing that is because he's trying to explain I believe, the Ashtalshlus, the evolution of Midos. He's using Chesed as the operative example, but how Midos go from the highest levels downward. So he continues. Let me stop if anybody wants to ask anything. And now he comes to explain additional point regarding this. He says, and this will explain another fact. V'zehu, and this is what the Mukabolim Harishenim, the early Kabbalists, Shekoidim HaPardes v'Arizal, that preceded the Ramak and the Arizal. Pardes is the Ramak. So those earlier Kabbalists, when they would refer to Chesed, Koidim Lemidas HaChesed B'Shem Gedula. They called Chesed Gedula, like we say, HaGedula v'Hagvura v'Teferes. They called Chesed Gedula, greatness. V'Pardes v'Arizal, and the Pardes of Ramosha Koraviro and the Arizal, Koidim B'Shem Chesed. What they called Gedula, the Pardes and the Arizal called Chesed. Ayimashin is bar le'il b'zeh. Tells us to look earlier about this. Maybe you can find it. I don't remember exactly where it was. I know we definitely learned about it. Maybe with a search you can find it. Now, why? Why is that the case? Why did they call it Gedula and the Pardes and the Arizal call it Chesed? So he says, V'hainu, the Gedula hu b'chinas ha-Chesed shebo mitzad ha-Gedula shehu b'chinas bligvul. Beautiful explanation. Gedula, greatness, refers to Chesed that's coming mitzad due to the greatness of God, God's grandeur, which is bligvul, like similar to Micha, the Chesed of Atik. That's a Chesed that's higher than Atzilus. So they were talking about Chesed in its pure original form, higher than Atzilus, so it's Gedula. The Chesed, whereas the Chesed, as referred to the Pardes and the Arizal, is the Chesed that's already gone through a bittul. Here in bittul he means clearly a diminishment. Not quite in the same. Gedula demonstrates greatness, but bittul means almost like humility. V'tzimtzum, and concealment. So it's a chesed that's not blikvul. That's why he calls it bittul. There's ashpos chesed, like a king who's very magnanimous. So in his magnanimity, he's just bestowing chesed on everybody, like the day of a wedding of his child. It's coming mitzad gadlus. But then there's a chesed that comes mitzad shiflus atzmei. A person feels very humble, very, very, it's in a positive way he means here. The mishumzeh maniach atzmei. He doesn't feel magnanimous. It feels, I'm not worthy. So therefore, like katenti mikol achsadim, you can say maybe, that he feels like not worthy. So therefore, he does chesed, and that he calls mishum zeh maniach atzmei. So he places himself on a side, she'ein tzorich la'atzmei klum, where he feels I don't deserve anything on my own, ulashpia el azulas, and I must be to another. So the king, the first example, is on the contrary. He has everything, and he's in such a magnanimous state that he's just bestowing on everyone without limits. Here's the opposite. The person feels I don't deserve much. So I give it to someone else. So it's a chesed that's coming.
I don't need much, not I don't deserve. He doesn't say I don't deserve.
Well, that's how I'm translating it. So he says like this. Let's see. He puts himself aside. That I don't need anything. Ulashpia el azulas. Mashpia the zulas. It could be undeserved. It could also be just feels very limited, that I don't need anything for myself. Like a person says, and therefore the chesed flows. That's how he explains the difference between the two, gedula and chesed. Let's see what it says. Ukamoy kain hu bedugma lamayla. and so too is an example for above. That's an example, a human example. The b'chinas chesed the zoh, b'chinas hachesed shemitzad habitl, that the chesed of zoh, which is like the chesed that Moshe was mamshich, but or the Yud Gimel Mitzarachim that he was mamshich, is a chesed mitzad habitl. Yesh leimer k'moshe nizbol li'il shehu hayichud ba'kavon el yena. So on page 1428, if you remember, he said a yesh leimer. When he spoke about the Avodah, he spoke about how is it, he says, Bitl v'ayichud ba'kavon el yena. Now you're focusing on, one second. Yeah, we spoke there that the kavona is not chesed as a midah to be mashpia, but it's you're focusing on what is God's intention in giving chesed. So now he's concluding. He's saying chesed mitzad habitl. He's saying yesh leimer. It's similar to what we spoke before. The yichud bekavona el yena. You're not focusing on the flow of chesed per se, but on the kavona el yena. That's the bitl that he's referring to here. So it's a different level of bitl that he means here. Not bitl atzmei, that he says shiflus atzmei, but more that it's not about you, it's about the kavon el yena. Bad simtsum.
Are they talking about the original intent of Chesed by the Eibishter?
One second.
Not quite.
Not, well, original intent, you have to, when talking about higher than Atzilus, no. He's talking here in Atzilus, the intention in Atzilus is not a chesed, like in Bria, it's an actual relationship of kindness shown from one to another. In Atzilus, it's already a hargosha, you said, it's already an emotion called chesed, but in Atzilus, the main focus is on the godly dimension of the godly intention in chesed. Whereas higher than Atzilus, you can't even call it a midah, really. Like he said, there's no ispilus at all. That's what he said on page 1428. And now he's referring to it again. That it's the chesed, so there's chesed, but like in Atzilus, everything is like the ovis hamarkova. They're a chariot. It's just a vehicle to God's flow of chesed. That's the main focus in Atzilus, how it's a vehicle to God's expression. Whereas in Bria, it's the expression itself that becomes tangible.
So
and
in
of course,
Bria, we
higher,
could call it Gedulo.
In Bria. But Gedula is already higher than Atzilus.
In Bria,
this is
you
talking
could
about
also say
Atzilus
Gedulo.
bittel, called Chesed, not Gedula. Omnam b'chinas Chesed da'atik. Then he goes on to speak about Chesed da'atik. I'll stop here, which is higher. Well, he's not finished the topic, so let's. I think I would wait till we finish and I'm able to understand it all. I see this goes all the way to the bottom of the page, and even the next page.
So Bria could be called Gedulo.
Did you say the Ria?
Bria,
No.
yeah, Bria, because it's not a beetle. It's a Helgish already.
What do you say? The word Bria, like in creation, Bria?
The world of Bria.
No, not at all. Gedula is
above
Atzilus.
Atzilus.
Higher than Atzilus. Yeah, it's not Bria. It's higher than Atzilus.
No, but in Atzilus, it's not called Gedulo because it's beetle. You don't feel.
Bittel and Simtsum. Bittel and Simtsum. Bittel mitzat shiflus atzmei, he says.
Yeah, but in Eilam Bria, there is no the beetle. So
we're not talking about Bria yet. We're only talking about higher than Atzilus and Atzilus. He didn't get the Bria yet.
This notion of bittul of chesed, and in these high levels, is this in the nature of like you talk about the big picture of us being able to trace the steps back and connect with God himself? In other words, Chesed is a manifestation of God's very nature rather than a tangible thing like a kindness that we can touch or feel, but rather it's a conduit to
Yeah,
connect
but
to
which
God.
level are you talking about now? What you
Well,
just said is you conflated a lot of levels here.
yeah. Well,
You have to go step by step. Which level of Chesed are you referring to right now?
the one
Chesed
he
of
is with
Atzilus? Chesed
yes,
higher than Atzilus? Huh?
I think he's referring to
No,
Chesed
what are
higher
you
than
referring to?
Atzilus.
Which level of Chesed are you referring to right now?
The same one he's referring to.
Which one is he? He's talking about a lot of levels. There's Chesed of Atzilus,
Right.
there's Chesed of Arich, there's Chesed of Atik, and then there's higher levels. He's talking about many levels here.
I guess I'm talking about this level of Gedula. I don't know exactly where that is in Kesser.
Gedula is
but-
Lamayla Atzilus. He called Gedula, he said, is Bligvol, Chaya Neshamis. He said, he gave it several names. It's Lifnei Atzilus. It's Lamayla Atzilus.
Right. That's what I said, above Atzilus. I didn't
Okay,
know
good.
exactly.
So you're talking about that level?
Yes.
Okay, what about it?
That he's explaining again. You talk about retracing the steps. We understand what Chesed is by us, like you said, give tzedakah, do a kindness, a favor. But what is it that high? What is it that high? That further, that much? I say, in its
It's the divine attribute of Chesed that is not related necessarily to our actions, and it's not affected by our actions. It's not an emotion like when you and I do Chesed to each other, we reciprocate. Like he spoke at length on page 1428. It's Lamaila Hein Atzmim, Loishem Ispalim Min Azulos. Just go back to page 428. He explains exactly what that level is.
I think what I'm trying to say
it's
is
Tev Be'etzem, and it's just as it discusses on page 1428 what that level is. That's what he's referring to here.
Yeah. But in terms of how we can relate to it, I guess what I'm trying to say is it's a way of connecting with God in a way that you're not getting anything out of it. It's like you're returning to your parent. Let me put it this way: it's
That's
almost
fine.
like
That's fine. You can
getting
receive. That's fine.
Yeah. Okay.
Enough said. I got it. I understand. You can say that. Why not?
Is that accurate? Okay. Yeah.
It's one way to explain it.
Yeah. I sort of look at it. I mean, this is going to be crass, but it's almost like getting a hug from your parent. Like you're not really getting anything out of that. You're getting love, but when you walk away from the hug, oh, you may feel closer, maybe you feel better, but you didn't get anything tangible out of it. But yet there's something about being embraced by your parent that is
it's
comforting.
the language. Yeah, it's the language I've used. It's experiencing God on God's terms, not on your terms.
Thank you. That's what I was trying to say.
That's as you climb, that's what goes. It starts first with you and how God relates to you and your benefits. Like you just ate a meal, you thank God he gave you a meal. So that's God on your terms, the benefits you're getting. And as you go higher, we've learned at length. Like first he spoke about Torah. You learn Torah in order for us to gain from Torah. But then comes levels where you're learning Torah for Torah itself, for connecting. And yes, to connect to higher. Like I said, Asher Kedushanim Mitzvah V'Tzivanu. It's God giving us a mitzvah. Then comes the detail, la'aniach tefillin. What specific mitzvah detail? That's the general gist of it. Yeah.
I want to inject that they found studies that show that hugs actually like contribute to emotional well-being and all that stuff. So if we're going to use that muscle, that when we get something from Hashem's terms, it's also like wellness that we don't know about.
No, we definitely benefit from it, but it's not driven by our needs as much as receiving that, and that's part of what we're going to learn. Yes, there's ultimately experiencing God on God's terms, experiencing God on our terms. That's like Yichudi Taton, Yichudi Ilah, and then there's joining them together, and we can benefit from it even if we're not doing it for the benefit.
Yeah. It's kind of like a child that wants to know its parent, and the parent, so this is again a crass example, but a child that doesn't feel that they know their parent well enough, and that somehow that causes a lack, a chisaron in them because they don't know themselves. If they can't know their parent, they can't understand what makes them tick unless they understand what makes their parent tick. So by getting to know their parent better, somehow it gives them a shlemus for themselves, but they're getting to know their parent on the parent's terms. Like, who is this person? Not how does it relate to me, but what makes my parent tick? And somehow by doing that, I get a shlemus within myself versus a child who doesn't know his parent or her parent, and they're lost or they're relatively more lost. Is that a fair mushal?
Yeah, but I wouldn't use it right here. It's a fair mushal in general. I don't know if that I would apply the gedula to that level that you just described, but if it works, like I said, there's different ways to apply things, each person according to their level. If this for you is a level higher than the benefits on a lower level of chesed, then it works. It's an application.
Speaking of
applications, as long as they work for you in your avodah, there's always it can't be
There's
wrong.
something meaningful or valuable there. I hear you.
Gedula before the Ramak and that
But I'm saying, but
result.
everybody this may work for one person, may not work for another.
Yeah, I hear you.
Is Chesed, is Kedusha Yesod?
Is what?
Kedusha.
I don't know.
Because in the davening, like I noticed, where it substitutes Gedula, it also doesn't say Yesod, but it says Kedusha.
I know there's the pasuk. It says Hagdula Hagvura v'Hatiferes, Hanetzich v'Ahoid, and then the expression is Kol. What's the lashon after that? Hanetzich v'Ahoid, Kol Asher Ba'aretz,
Ki
Shemayim
choil.
v'Ba'aretz.
Ki choil.
What?
Ki choil.
Ki Chayil. That's Yisod, and B'Shemayim v'Aretz is Malchus. Yeah.
But in Yishtabach, there's the way it's
I don't
phrased
know.
made me think.
Honestly, that has to be looked up. I can't say. I don't know.
But Kol is like Yesod, I guess. Yeah, because Yosef is called Kol, right?
Well, Yisod is called Kol. So, yeah. Okay, I'm going to stop here. Where are we? Yeah, 2/3 of the way down. Page 1430. Let's stop here.